Welcome to the next in our series of online lectures for Western Civ 2. Today we are going to continue our discussion of the French Revolution. In fact, we are going to see the French Revolution grow far more violent than we have seen in previous lectures. This violence is going to have an important role in pushing events forward. So please pay attention to that as we're going through this lecture. Also, pay attention to the terms that are up on the first slide, as well as the questions that are at the bottom of the screen. So with that said, let's get to it. Let's recap events before we get to something new. So, where are we? By the end of the 1780s, France was heading for a crisis. A spiraling debt coupled with food shortages and high taxes raised tensions across the nation. To meet this crisis, the king called for a meeting of the Estates General in the year 1789. This representative body met only at the king's request. In fact, the Estates General had not met since 1614. But this meeting of the Estates General would be nothing like past meetings. At this meeting in 1789, the Third Estate, inspired by the ideas of the Enlightenment, will rebel against the elites in French society. In June of 1789, the Third Estate will declare itself to be a national assembly. It will argue that it alone has the right to govern France because it represented the common people, the Third Estate. The National Assembly announced that it would also write a new constitution for France based on the principles of the Enlightenment. This act amounted to a revolution against the rule of an absolute king. Which leaves us with one question. What will the king do? Will he allow the revolution to continue? Or will he crack down and restore the old order? While the king was trying to figure out what to do at Versailles, things began to heat up in Paris. The poorest of the poor are still struggling in Paris. Remember those high food prices? Well, they're still high, and this has caused tensions to run high in the capital city. Moreover, the poor of Paris have been closely watching events with the National Assembly at Versailles. For the most part, they support the revolution and what's happening at Versailles. By July, there is a real fear among many of the poor of Paris that the king is planning on sending in the army to break up the National Assembly and end the revolution before it can really begin. On July 12, 1789, tensions will boil over when the people of Paris storm the great fortress named the Bastille in the center of the city. The Bastille was an old storehouse for weapons and gunpowder. The Bastille was also an old prison, notorious for torture and cruelty. Once the mob broke through the gates, they killed the guards, cut off their heads, and carried them around on long spears. Why is this important? Why do we remember the storming of the Bastille today? Well, the storming of the Bastille is important because it shows that the poor peasants of Paris support the revolution. It also shows that this revolution has two sides. There's the peaceful side that's happening in the National Assembly at Versailles, but there's also always a possibility for violence in Paris. I want to repeat this point because it really is important. The revolution has two sides. There's the peaceful side, the political revolution, that's happening in the National Assembly at Versailles. But as I said, there is always a possibility for violence, and it is this possibility for violence among the mob in Paris that is preventing the king from using his army to destroy the National Assembly. The king is afraid of what might happen should he provoke the anger of the mob. What would they do next? While the king is trying to figure out what to do, this actually buys time for the political revolution at Versailles. In August of 1789, the National Assembly will publish a document that is going to become known as one of the most important things to come out of the French Revolution. This document is called the Declaration of the Rights of Man. The Declaration is similar to our American Declaration for Independence. It is a statement of what the revolution is supposed to be about. So what does the Declaration of the Rights of Man say? Well, here are just 3 points from this declaration. I'll read them for you. Point number 1. Men are born free and remain free and equal in rights. Social distinctions can be based only on public utility. Interesting ideas there. Number 2. The aim of every political association is the preservation of the natural and imprescriptible rights of man. These rights are liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. Lastly, the sources of all sovereignty reside essentially in the nation. No body, no individual can exercise authority that does not proceed from it in plain terms. Now, I don't think you need me to tell you this, but you can hear the ideas of the Enlightenment coming through the Declaration of the Rights of Man. In fact, many, as I said, argue that this is the high point of the revolution. Part of the reason for that is because things are about to get violent once again. Once again, things begin in Paris. The food crisis has continued to grow as Paris gets closer and closer to winter. This concern over food and food prices will lead once again to violent mob action. In October of 1789, a Paris mob, furious over its lack of food and the high cost of bread in Paris, will march on the King and Queen's royal palace at Versailles. Like the storming of the Bastille, this was one of the key moments of the early days of the Revolution. This painting is meant to depict the mob as it marches toward Versailles. I hope you can notice a few things about this painting. First of all, almost everyone in this painting is a woman. These women are also dressed in very plain peasant outfits. In other words, this painting is meant to represent the poor women of Paris. You can notice they are armed with almost medieval weaponry. They have long spears and pikes and axes. One woman has managed to drag a cannon along with her. And also, if you look at the very end of the line, there is a woman in a much nicer outfit, in a much nicer dress, and she seems to be being pulled along by the mob. She doesn't seem to want to be going to Versailles. So anyway, this painting tells us a lot about the mob that marched on Versailles. It tells us a lot about the gender of this mob. They were women. It tells us a lot about the social class of these women. Most of them were poor peasant women. As I mentioned earlier, the mob was angry because they couldn't feed their families. The cost of bread was simply too high. Food was still in such short supply. Therefore, the mob simply grew angrier and angrier as it moved toward Versailles. Once they reached the king's palace, they actually became so enraged that they actually broke through the gates and broke into the palace. As the mob rampaged through the royal quarters, they threatened the queen's life and killed her guards. Ultimately, the mob will be convinced to go back to Paris. once they are promised flour and food from the king's private stores. But in addition to that flour and that food, they get something else as well. The king and his family agree to leave Versailles and move back to Paris. This is a critical victory for the revolution. While the king was living at Versailles, he remained isolated and free to act as he pleased. In Paris, however, he will be surrounded by the mob. It will be much harder for the king to act on his own. Thus, in July of 1790, the king will have little choice but to accept the new constitution when it was presented to him by the National Assembly. That constitution will radically change France from an absolutist state to a constitutional monarchy. In other words, the king was allowed to keep his job. However, his power will now be limited by the Constitution. To rule alongside the king, a new National Assembly will be created. This new National Assembly will have the power to pass laws for the nation. In the past, of course, it was the king who simply created laws by his whim and by his declaration. Now, the power to create laws will come from the National Assembly. At the same time, the Constitution will address the power of the Church as well. Protestants and Jews in France were granted religious toleration. Moreover, the Church was forced to give up its property. The land would be sold to help pay off the government's debt. Finally, all priests and church officials would be required to take an oath of loyalty to the new constitution. Those that refused would not be allowed to celebrate Mass. These reforms will ensure that the church will become an enemy of the revolution. Church officials hate the revolution, and they will fight it at every turn from now on. Once the king agreed to the new constitution, many believed that the French Revolution was over. But was it? In fact, there were still a number of questions remaining to be resolved. Moreover, there were still a number of enemies of the revolution. The Roman Catholic Church was just one enemy. The king, in fact, was another. He, in fact, will have a number of cards left to play. And once he does, he is going to send the revolution spiraling down a path of terror and violence.